every single layer 2 has to have some Bitcoin somewhere that's owned by the system in layer 1, right? So you can't get away from that. One of the things that's kind of cool though about layer 2s that I think is worth pointing out is that there is the possibility to make them interoperate. I think Lightning will be the connective tissue between all the different layer 2s. All the cool like smart contracting and like covenant sale stuff I was talking about earlier that Liquid has, when you add this like Lightning interface, suddenly it makes it easier for anyone with like a Lightning wallet to interact with, right? Hopefully by the end of this year we'll have splicing. It'll be like revolutionary, I think, in terms of like wallet technology for Lightning. Having more informed consumers and Bitcoiners like across the spectrum at every level is like very important. I think the thing that when people start trying to say layer 3, layer 4 is now they're no longer talking about transacting with Bitcoin.
Lisa Neigut is the founder of Base 58, a Bitcoin protocol academy helping developers learn the fundamentals of Bitcoin. In our conversation, we explored Bitcoin's layer 2 ecosystem. We got into the goals, the trade-offs, and the potential for various layer 2 solutions. We also explored interoperability at layer 2 and what lies beyond layer 2. If you enjoy this episode and if you learn something new, the best way you can show your support for this show is by sending in sats over the Lightning Network. You can use any Podcasting 2.0 app to do it. There are dozens of them out there, but my favorite one to use is Fountain. Before we get into today's show, just a quick message from our sponsors. Today's show is sponsored by Voltage. Voltage is the premier provider of Bitcoin and Lightning node infrastructure. Today's show is also sponsored by Stackwork. And Stackwork is a Lightning-powered transcription tool that takes the best of AIs and humans to create better, faster, and less expensive transcripts. We'll have more from Voltage and Stackwork later in the show. Lisa, welcome back this is your second time on the show, and today we're going to be talking about layer 2 technology, scaling in layers, why Bitcoin needs layers. We got a lot to cover. Maybe just as a very first kind of like introduction to layers, let's give people a refresher. Why does Bitcoin scale in layers?
Yeah, so I think this kind of goes back to like the whole thing about, Bitcoin is a blockchain. What does that mean? It means that when you make a transaction with Bitcoin, your transaction has to go in a block, right? So it's a chain of blocks. One of the things about Bitcoin is that those blocks have a certain size. There was a whole thing back in like 2016, 2017 about how big those blocks should be. So like there's kind of this whole thing about like the Bitcoin, the blockchain layer, that you can only fit so many transactions inside of a block. There's only so many blocks that happen every hour, which means only so many people can transact with Bitcoin every day, right? So typically we tend to call this first layer, layer 1. And then the idea is that they take this layer 1 and they're like, okay, well, not everyone can transact in Bitcoin in layer 1 in the blocks. How can we make it such that Bitcoin can still be used and transacted? So the object that you're transacting with is a Bitcoin object or Bitcoin derivative or something. How do we make it such that you can still transact with Bitcoin and it's Bitcoin denominated and it's still a decentralized protocol? It's still peer-to-peer. So you're still transacting between yourself and another party, and as little as possible, like there is no intermediary. So how do we keep it as much like a peer-to-peer cash network system that uses Bitcoin as possible? But how can we do this without using transactions that go inside blocks? And so that kind of becomes the challenge that a layer 2 protocol is trying to solve. Yeah, and so I've given a talk a few times kind of where I go through like Bitcoin as a layer cake. It's like what I've called it. And so the idea is I walk through like what is the second layer like composed of, like what are the different pieces that most traditional, I call them traditional, but like most layer 2s like kind of tend to solve the problem the same way. There might be a few exceptions to that, which makes them interesting in their own right? But typically like then, so how do you transact with Bitcoin not in a block, right? And the idea is that you could do it with first thing is like you need a new accounting mechanism, or you need a new system to do the accounting in, right? Because Bitcoin at the end of the day is just a big accounting system. It says I have Bitcoin and maybe Kevin has Bitcoin, and that's like that is all you can do with Bitcoin is you can express values. Like Lisa has like 1 Bitcoin in the ledger, and then Kevin has 2 Bitcoin in the ledger or something like that. Um, and we use blocks to do accounting for that. When you don't stop using blocks to do accounting, because we can't all fit all of our transactions inside blocks, all of a sudden you kind of start needing you need new accounting system, so a new way of doing accounting. Um, and so a lot of different systems kind of have different ways of doing that. And so you need a new place to keep track of where that accounting is. And then you also kind of need a way of relating the Bitcoin in this new accounting system that you are creating in layer 2 to the Bitcoin, original Bitcoin, like layer 1 Bitcoin, right? And typically the way that they do that is you make something called a multisig on the first layer. So everyone who wants to participate in the Bitcoin accounting system layer 2 will take their Bitcoin on layer 1 and lock it into a multisig of some type. And then locking it into the multisig on layer 1 makes it such that it kind of like puts it in a special like box on layer 1, and it's like, okay, now all the accounting for who owns the Bitcoin in this little box on layer 1, we're going to use this other system, and that's going to be the layer 2, so to speak. And so that's kind of how a layer 2 is built on top of the layer 1, right? You put all of the Bitcoin on layer 1 in a box, and then when you want to transact with it, you use this other accounting system, where you write down who owns what. And so the cool thing about that is that when you want to make a transaction using the layer 2, you don't have to write it down on the blockchain. You write it down in a second accounting system. I'm sure maybe an example would make this like a little easier to kind of totally understand what's happening. But yeah, so then instead of writing it into the blockchain, like we could, for example, write down balances on napkins and pass napkins back and forth. So Kevin and I could lock our 3 Bitcoin into a multisig on the first chain in layer 1, and then in our layer 2 could be the napkin system, and that's kind of like an honored based system to some extent, and we have to agree on what the balance is in the Bitcoin on the napkin. And then when we want to transact, we just update the napkin. So we break down, Nifty now has like 2 Bitcoin and Kevin has 1 Bitcoin because Kevin paid her a Bitcoin to come on the podcast. No, kidding. um but we keep that all on the napkin layer, if that makes sense. And then at the end of the day, if you want to like exit the layer 2, then there has to be a way that um you can get your money out of that shared box on the layer 1, if that makes sense. So you could exit it. So that would, exiting layer 2 would involve throwing the napkin away and sending the money out of the like the locked multi-sig box on layer 1. So that's kind of like my way of thinking about layer 2s, of kind of like how do layer 2s work. It might be a little bit there might be other ways to do it, but I haven't really seen them yet. Maybe they'll show up at like Bitcoin plus plus next week, and we can I can see kind of like how those work. But yeah.
So that makes sense. I think one point of confusion I think a lot of people have, and I had at the beginning of learning about layer twos, was that there are lots of layer two solutions, which, in my head, when I think of layers, I think you mentioned a cake. I think of maybe like a hamburger. You have the patty, you have the lettuce on top, and the lettuce covers all of the patty. And then you have the tomatoes, which covers all of the lettuce. But here it's like the layer two is actually many different layers, each contributing their own features. Why is this important that we have multiple layer twos while we only have one layer one?
Yeah, so the reason you can have multiple layer 2s has to do with the fact that like anyone who owns Bitcoin can come together with anyone else who owns Bitcoin and decide to come up with a new way of keeping track of who owns what Bitcoin. Like they can put it into a shared account on the Bitcoin layer. And then as soon as you have a shared account, you can use any kind of accounting system you want to keep track of who owns that Bitcoin. Um, but you still need the layer 1 of where you're locking the Bitcoin up, right? And so whenever I give this analogy, people always ask me, well, does Coinbase count as a layer 2 then, because they've got a whole bunch of Bitcoin that you've paid them, and they have a database where they're keeping track of who owns what Bitcoin. um the I think like what do you call it? I think like the way of thinking about it is sorry, yeah, so like I think the idea is that like yeah, we all, because one of the features of a layer 2 is that it is a like way of accounting for who owns what Bitcoin. Every single layer 2 has to have some Bitcoin somewhere that's owned by the system in layer 1, right? So you can't get away from that. But based on this definition of layer 2 being just like some sort of different accounting system, some new way or some different way of keeping track of who owns what Bitcoin, um, there is no like there's like a lot of flexibility there. So everyone who's making an L2 has to build on top of L1 because one of the definitions is that your L2 needs to be based in Bitcoin and denominated in Bitcoin, which means you need to own Bitcoin, which means that you have like a layer 1 interaction, right? Like you own some of the asset on layer 1. But the way that the layer 2 that you can invent on top of that, it's like sort of like I don't know. This kind of like there's no rules. I mean there are rules, but like there's a lot less rules, right? And since like any amount of people could come together and put Bitcoin in like a multi-sig to some extent, um, you could get a whole bunch. You could get like thousands of different ways of having an L2, so to speak. Then there's kind of like a process then that you can put on top of like okay, well, if anything can, not anything, but like if there's a bunch of different ways of doing like scaling, like transacting with Bitcoin without actually using Bitcoin, you kind of have a second accounting system. um, what kind of features do you want in that accounting system? And it's like, well, so lightning is probably one of the more famous layer 2 examples. The cool things about lightning is that it kind of preserves this really nice peer-to-peer cash way of transacting with Bitcoin. So you're able to transact Bitcoin with anyone who's like on the network, so to speak, like on the Lightning network. So you have to be in the network. That sounds, yeah. But it lets you transact Bitcoin in a way that I would say is still fairly like peer to peer and decentralized. So so I guess like compare and contrast that to like, okay, if we call Coinbase a layer 2, which isn't, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but Bitcoin, Coinbase owns a lot of Bitcoin on behalf of other people, and the way that they keep track of who owns the Bitcoin on behalf of, they have a database with your name and a number in it, right? And then if I wanted to transact with another one of Coinbase's people at Coinbase, they would just update the numbers in the database next to our names, and that would be a transaction. And since databases can be updated all the time, you could do millions of transactions with Bitcoin, with Coinbase Bitcoin, with the promise that Coinbase will pay you Bitcoin for that Bitcoin. Uh, you could do that millions of times and like not have any kind of there's no real cost there. It's very cheap to update a database. You can do lots of database updates in a day. So unlike layer 1, which like had a block and you could only do a couple hundred transactions an hour, or maybe thousands of transactions an hour, but it's limited, right? When you have like a Coinbase database, you can do millions of transactions an hour and it's no big deal. Um, right. Okay. But the thing with Coinbase is that at the end of the day, Coinbase is the one who owns the Bitcoin on the layer 1, right? And all that you own is a claim on that, legally speaking. We say that Coinbase has to pay that out to you. And if Coinbase goes bankrupt, or if someone steals all of Coinbase's Bitcoins, they have a rogue employee, then what is your like entry in the database worth? Well, probably not a whole lot if like, if someone steals all their Bitcoin. So the idea with Lightning, which is like kind of more proper layer 2 because it's like decentralized. Well, I don't know. What makes it proper? I don't know. But like, so the thing about Lightning is that the way that Lightning works is that you're transacting using kind of a different accounting system. So instead of using a database, you're now using sort of hard, like the Bitcoin transaction equivalent of a napkin. That sounds like kind of maybe hard to maybe sort of hard to parse if you don't really understand what a transaction is. But if you think of a Bitcoin transaction as like a piece of paper that isn't actually a valid transaction until you include it in a block. So think of block as like a big file folder. If you can get your transaction piece into the big file folder, it's considered like into a block, it's considered valid. Um, the way that we work with Lightning, though, is you just keep that piece of paper, that transaction, you write up the transaction, and you make it a valid transaction. So it could get into a block at some point. We just never try to put it in a block. We just use the existence of the valid transaction as the mechanism for keeping track of who owns what. So at any point in time, you could go back to layer one and get your Bitcoin out. But you don't, because it's way easier to update a piece of paper between two people than it is to put it into the blockchain and have to wait and pay for it to get into a block. What am I trying to say with this, though? I don't know. Maybe I've lost the thread here, but I don't know.
That's a helpful background, I think, on layer two and why we have, you know, why we have different layer twos. And my next question is about, often when we say layer two solutions, people say layer two scaling solutions. And the implication is that these are all helping people onboard people to Bitcoin and grow Bitcoin adoption. But I believe there are some layer two solutions that are actually also introducing new features that are not necessarily just scaling Bitcoin transactions, right? Like things like you can do securities tokens on Liquid and things like that, right? You're introducing new things to Bitcoin as well. So how do you break those two apart? Like there's a certain class of these layer two solutions that are specifically devoted to scaling Bitcoin. And then there are others which are devoted to adding new features to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think like I mean, so it kind of goes back to like that accounting system, right? So like we add a new so layer two lets you kind of invent a new accounting system, so to speak, for the whatever thing. So like some accounting systems, so like Liquid Bitcoin, the Liquid network, like is kind of maybe an interesting way of like of doing new accounting. So like for Liquid, which is Blockstream's sidechain project for Bitcoin, the new accounting method that they're using over on Liquid is it's another blockchain. It's still blockchain, but it's another blockchain. Blocks come faster. I think they might be a little bigger. So that means like throughput wise, you still kind of have a limit on how many transactions you can have, but they're fast. They're much faster um, than on main chain. And then the one of the things about like that new blockchain that they added is they got to add a lot of new features. So you can do covenants on Liquid. You can do covenants in Liquid transactions. There's ways to make assertions about how things can be spent on Bitcoin that aren't available in the normal Bitcoin blockchain. They also added to these transactions the ability to issue new assets and be able to do transactions with those assets. They added something called confidential transactions, which is where you can blind what's being transacted in a transaction so that whenever you make a transaction on Liquid, it's more private. No one can see like the amounts that you're transacting with. I think are or how much of an amount is going to who is like hidden. So they've added these are all features that got added because they're using this like new accounting system, which in this case is a whole nother blockchain where they've built a whole new set of features into it. So whenever you start using a new accounting system, that gives you some opportunity to add new stuff in there, if that makes sense. So it lets you do other things and just trade Bitcoin, like things that say I own
Right.
Bitcoin to some extent. Yeah, they like I think another cool example is like one big project that we're excited to have at Bitcoin Plus Plus. We haven't really talked about Bitcoin Plus Plus yet, but it's a conference that I'm doing next week in Austin. It'll be Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the 28th, 29th, and 30th of April. It's all about layer twos. We're going to have a lot of talks from a really big project called Fediment, which is a project to make sort of decentralized Bitcoin banks, which is using eCash, which is like a eCash is like another way of doing like kind of an accounting system of who owns what from like a central issuer of these tokens. Um, but one cool thing about eCash, like the eCash tokens, is the privacy on them is very much better than writing something into a blockchain. So, because like with a blockchain, you get a history of I made a transaction, and then the person I sent that to made a transaction, and so you kind of have this like history that exists forever of where these coins have gone on a blockchain. One of the cool things you can do with eCash is you oh no, sorry. You can remove the eCash tokens, you remove the ability to kind of track the history of the coins. Each coin kind of becomes this bearer instrument. That sounds weird, but it has value because you own it. Like you're bearing, it bears the value itself. That doesn't have a history. And so, what's nice about not having a history then is that it makes it very hard to figure out like where that money has been or what your history of transacting has been with that, like with those tokens. So, this is kind of like a different privacy story is what I would say that eCash tokens have than like a blockchain. And it's cool because having a layer two, like a new accounting mechanism, makes it possible so that you can kind of try out different ways of keeping track of who owns what and like different privacy features, etc., than what you have like on the main blockchain of Bitcoin. Um, and it's cool because layer twos basically let you denominate all of the accounting in all of the like values of the things in Bitcoin. So you can kind of seamlessly keep your Bitcoin balance and still spend Bitcoin and still transact in Bitcoin. Um, but you get to do it across kind of different systems, like different sorts of like features, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's really cool to see how many people are building so many different things on layer two. To some degree, it feels like these are headed in slightly different directions, and maybe that's okay. These experiments are just, people are just running new ideas and seeing whether they work or not. But I wonder, what is your view on whether or not it's important to focus more on scaling throughput of Bitcoin transactions, or adding new privacy features, or adding new securities on Bitcoin? Like, where do you think the community should be headed? If you could kind of like nudge this layer two community and say, hey guys, let's focus on this. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like I don't think I have a good answer because I'm too much of a well, let's just see, like let's everyone experiment and see what sticks because like I think that the truth is that most layer twos, so like Liquid still uses a blockchain, so like the scaling there is kind of like that probably won't fit the next billion people coming onto Bitcoin, right? I think when a lot of people talk about scaling, and I know like Liz Stark from like Lightning Labs, if you listen to her talk about Lightning, the thing that she says publicly in her talks is like we're taking Lightning to the next billion people, right? Like we want to make Lightning such that the next billion people can get onto Bitcoin, right? Um, so I know that they're really focused on the scaling story around Lightning. Brought that up for a reason. So like, okay, so like if we take that as like the goal, like okay, how do we get the next billion people onto Bitcoin? Like removing like it necessarily has to be on Lightning. How do we get the next billion people to be transacting with Bitcoin in like a decentralized way? So just like we could just put everyone, we just say everybody give your Bitcoin to Coinbase. We're just gonna use their database. All billion of us will fit in there. It'll be great. We'll all just be on the Coinbase database thing. And that'll scale Bitcoin. We can scale Bitcoin that way. But that's problematic from a Bitcoiner standpoint, right? Because you have this trust in Coinbase then. And then if Coinbase went away or got raided by the US government or something, like, got in a court case and had to hand over all its Bitcoin, then everyone who had the next billion of us with like our Bitcoin on Coinbase would be, what's the phrase, shit out of luck. Right. So
Yeah.
that's like an easy scaling solution, but it's not very useful. So what are like some of the other ways you could get a billion people? Well, Liquid probably wouldn't be a good place to put like the next billion people, right? Because it's a blockchain, and at some level it can do a lot more throughput um than the main base layer can, but it will probably take it's probably too many people for that particular system, right? So then it's like, okay, well, can Lightning fit a billion people? You start getting into kind of some of the intricacies of how Lightning works exactly in terms of how Lightning channels function and that sort of thing. I think a lot of people will tell you that getting the next billion people on Lightning is going to be quite challenging and take a lot of on-chain transactions. So that actually is going to be quite expensive and take a long time and fill up a lot of Bitcoin layer one blocks to get a billion people onto the current version of Lightning. So then you're like, okay, well, maybe like an eCash token can bring the next billion people onto Lightning or onto Bitcoin. What does that look like? Because eCash tokens are really easy. It's almost like, to some extent, it's almost, I might be slightly wrong about this, but it's almost the same as having like a database entry at Coinbase, but who owns the coins and how you get them out. And Coinbase needs to know your identity, and you have to be KYC'd in order to get a data entry in their database. Whereas on eCash token, you just use some cryptographic proofs instead of like identity stuff to prove that you own coins. So like yeah, so I guess I'm saying like all of these different layer two things, like if you're looking to get like a billion people into Bitcoin, like how do we get a billion people holding and like able to transact with Bitcoin in a day, right? Kind of like how can we get like a billion people transacting with Bitcoin every day? um yeah, I think that all of the different layer twos, I think, start to kind of take different um seem like they have like a different, what do you call it, like possibility space around that.
Mhm.
Yeah. One of the things that's kind of cool though about layer twos that I think is worth pointing out is that there is the possibility to make them interoperate. So maybe it's kind of like trading. Like, so if you think of every layer two as sort of like a claim to some extent on Bitcoin that exists somewhere on layer one, right? So they're sort of like derivatives. Like, maybe I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, whatever. I feel like there's like certain keywords that like you're not really supposed to like um people get a little weird about because they have meanings and like certain senses. I'm not really sure what like the derivatives market, that's like a whole regulated space or whatever. But like to some extent, they're like sort of like, it's like it's a claim on Bitcoin that exists on layer one. All layer twos to some extent are claims on Bitcoin that exist somewhere on layer one. So this, I mean, puts a limit on how much Bitcoin can ever be in a layer two. Well, every layer two amount of Bitcoin is a claim on Bitcoin that exists in layer one. So you can never have more value in the entire ecosystem, layer one or layer two, than the total amount of Bitcoin that exists anywhere, right? So you're capped at 21 million across every layer two, right? But this is what makes them interoperable, right? Is that they're all worth Bitcoin. It's all Bitcoin. It's just different accounting systems, and you can make these different accounting systems like kind of talk to each other, or you can do trades across the accounting systems. So one of the cool examples of this is Fedimint. So like Fedi, the big project, is working on, or has basically shipped something called their Lightning Gateway, which is your ability to take eCash tokens and pay Lightning invoices using your eCash tokens. And the way that you do that is there are Lightning nodes that will accept eCash tokens and an invoice that you want to pay. They'll pay the invoice on your behalf and take your eCash tokens, right? So they'll do that trade where um they'll have lightning available to pay out, and they will exchange that lightning Bitcoin that they have for the eCash tokens that you have to give them, right? And it's all Bitcoin under the hood. And they take maybe a small fee for that service, which is kind of cool because that conversion is not exactly free, question mark. I don't know, you start getting into weird questions of what does it mean to have liquidity. But yeah, so these layer twos become like interoperable in a certain sense, which is really cool, I think.
Are all these layer twos going to be interoperable with one another? Because like we're going to get into this later in the episode, but there's a lot of layer two solutions that we want to cover here. There's a lot you're going to cover next week at BTC plus plus. Just to rhyme off a few for folks, we have Lightning, Liquid, state chains, drive chain, validity rollups, trustless bridges, RGB, Fedimint. I know all those are not perfectly interoperable with each other today. Is that the goal, to get to where all of them can work with each other and kind of like, move funds between them without ever touching layer one?
I don't think that's anyone's like explicit goal, but I think that it will sort of like my way of like I think what's going to happen across the layer 2 space, and maybe I've been saying this for a while now, is I think Lightning will be the connective tissue between all the different layer 2s. So I think what's going to happen is that like Lightning will end up being the language of layer 2, if that makes sense. Like if you want to pay for something. So I think most merchants will accept Lightning, if that makes sense. And then all of these other like eCash tokens or feta mints or whatnot, or maybe like you have like assets on Liquid or something. The way that you'll get them into like the larger ecosystem will be through like Lightning channels, that are then used to kind of like scoot between all the different layer 2s. So not to say that there won't be maybe some way that like a Fedimint and like a Liquid network won't be able to like do an exchange, or sediments are meant to be kind of distributed, so every kind of like the way I like think about them as community banks or like a credit union. And so different credit unions being able to like exchange deposits will probably happen. So I could like have my local, like, I don't know, maybe Base 58 launches a Fedimint. So if you're a Base 58 student, you can use the Base 58 Fedimint sort of thing. And then you want to be able to talk to, like, I don't know, let's say Austin BitDoves has its own Fedimint. I don't think that's like whatever, but and then so if you had Base 58 eCash and you wanted to exchange it for whatever, I think there'll probably be a way, something will probably pop up that lets it do that. But I think that for most, like, I think for most projects, like Liquid included, and this is actually something I would like to see happen more on Liquid, is like a more of a lightning interface, right? So that just lets you, like, anything that you then have, like, so then once you get like those interfaces, all the cool like smart contracting and like covenant sales stuff I was talking about earlier that Liquid has, when you add this like Lightning interface, suddenly it makes it easier for anyone with like a Lightning wallet to interact with, right? So you could build stuff on, you could build cool, interesting things like contracts on Liquid, and then use Lightning to get like deposit money into a contract and then pull it back out later, all with Lightning.
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just a quick message from our sponsor, Voltage. Voltage empowers engineers to integrate Bitcoin and Lightning Network payments into their business stack with an enterprise grade experience. The team at Voltage is building the complete toolset so that you can do more than simply spin up nodes, but also understand and interpret your node's data. Their new product Surge gives engineers the capability to quickly solve problems and optimize operations. With node insights and visibility through time series data, you get dynamic and complex insights never available before. You can get complete control with insanely fast onboarding, advanced client-side encryption, and zero management infrastructure, making backups, networking, and upgrades simple. Get a free 7-day trial today at voltage.cloud. So when you think about the hierarchy then of layer 2, or the structure, I guess, of layer 2 solutions, is it right to think of it as Lightning potentially becoming a hub and all the other solutions being spokes on that wheel?
Yeah, maybe with like their own little ecosystem, right? So like if you want to do transactions and stuff. So like one problem with Lightning that I is kind of hard is like end user balances. Like if you're running like a big wallet or something, it's really hard to have end user balances be denominated in like Lightning Bitcoin for reasons that that are sort of like I don't really want to get into. So it's like just kind of a hard, complicated problem to have. Like you want people to be to hold the Bitcoin, right? So you want them to have the like channel open to them, right? And splicing will help like a huge amount with this, but which is like a new Lightning thing that's coming out soon, hopefully. Hopefully by the end of this year we'll have splicing. It'll be like revolutionary, I think, in terms of like wallet technology for Lightning. Um, it's probably the most exciting feature that we're going to ship on Lightning this year, just because of how it gives you so much more control over your liquidity than you currently have. But the when you start like looking at like the scaling problems of Lightning, it gets really like, what do you call it? The you kind of almost need like a new accounting mechanism for who owns what in what channel kind of thing. So I think this is where things like Fedimint start looking really attractive because it makes it such that like lots and lots of people can have Bitcoin that they hold that's theirs, but that the way of accounting for it is just not quite the same as Lightning, because Lightning as an accounting mechanism starts getting expensive in its current form.
I see. Now, so when we think about this layer two ecosystem, we've talked about some of the new use cases that are enabled. We've talked about scaling throughput. Is there anything that you think is missing in this layer two ecosystem today that we will need in the future, but we don't have today?
That's a good question. Something that we're missing that we don't have that we might get. Um, I'm blanking. I don't really, there's not anything that's like coming to mind for me, but I've probably been like very focused on like what kind of how I see like the layer two like ecosystem. I feel like there's definitely stuff that we haven't really talked about yet, which is like the roll up side of it. Like what do roll ups bring? What does like the RGB stuff bring? Like, people want to bring assets to like DLCs sort of to Bitcoin. I feel like when you start getting into like, well, roll-ups, I'm not really sure what roll-ups are, like the roll up side of things. My understanding is that it is kind of like a side chain. So I kind of think of it like Liquid. I might be wrong about this. Hopefully, I'll get corrected at Bitcoin Plus Plus next week because we have some really great Bitcoin roll up experts coming to tell us about their projects. But my understanding comes from like the ETH world of what a roll up is. And it's a lot like a side chain, which is what Liquid is. But basically, you do your transactions in a way, sort of in like a second place. Morning. You do your transactions in like a second location on a second um platform, at least in ETH, and then those get like kind of rolled up, condensed, batched down such that only like the summary of what happened gets committed to like the main chain. Um, I'm not exactly sure how to think about those. And the reason that I like am uncertain is that like I'm not really sure in a roll up for Bitcoin like where your coins live. Like, all of your Bitcoin, all Bitcoin has to exist at layer one, right? Like there's no Bitcoin that exists outside of that. Adding a layer two doesn't invent new Bitcoin. It just is a new way again of accounting for Bitcoin that already exists in layer one. So whenever you start transacting in a different way, like, so you take a roll up lets you do transactions. So like Kevin and I could transact with Bitcoin. In a way that gets sent to a batch of other people that are transacting with Bitcoin, right? So it's like a batching thing. So our transaction, my understanding, this is how I understand rollups. So there's somewhere that like then all these my transaction with Kevin, and then let's say I also transact with Bob over here, and Bob transacts with Carol, and all of our four transactions then kind of get summarized or condensed down into like a very like one line change instead of like five line change, and the only thing that we write to chain is like that condensed version of what's happened. The thing about that I'm not really sure about is like I don't where does that batching happen? Like where in the world, who is taking all these transactions? Like if I want to transact with Kevin on a roll up, who do I need to send my transaction to so that it gets batched up into the next like whatever, right? Like someone's got to be running that service where you can send all these transactions to, right? Um, and I think that those like all have sort of different proposals, and it sort of depends on who's running the roll up. On ETH, that's very centralized and tends to be run by one person, and starts looking a lot like a Coinbase, because you send your coins on the main chain to a wallet that's owned by like one organization, and then that gives you the ability to do stuff in their like little ecosystem, which is separate. Anyways, that's like a whole that might be totally different than how people are thinking about rollups on Bitcoin. But I think there's a lot of things around exactly who the actors are and how that relates, like how the fact that I own Bitcoin on layer one relates to my ability to transact in a rollup as a layer two, I'm not really certain of, and I'm really hoping I will find out all the answers to my questions next week.
Okay, so I have another question about incentives. And on Bitcoin's layer one, there's a lot, like, people love how the incentives are so well aligned between so many different participants that have kind of like we've ushered in Bitcoin because of this incentive system that we've built between miners, between users, between node operators. It just works. Is there that same incentive structure on layer two? And should there be?
Right. So every accounting system in layer two is slightly different, right? And the incentives on how that works and like kind of comes down to like who owns the keys to the large extent on layer twos, right? And sort of like making sure that the incentives of who own the keys are aligned with the people who claim to own the Bitcoin, right? I think maybe this is like a good maybe this is a good way of saying that. And I think that like it's sort of unclear in a lot of ways. Like sort of depends on the layer two, like when you lock your Bitcoin up into a multi-sig, are you one of the parties in the multi-sig is like a big part of it. There's definitely places like Fedimints and Liquid where you are not typically a party to the multi-sig. You're kind of giving someone else, like a group of people, your coins, and they give you claims on those coins that you can then get out later. Um, the so that's sort of like is the people who own the multi-sig, are they incentivized to act in your best interest in terms of making sure those coins stay where they are or get paid out to you when you go to ask for them. I think we're really hoping that we build technology that makes it such that um, your claims can like automatically be processed, that sort of thing. But I think that's like sort of a really difficult thing, and I think it's really why like Liquid Bitcoin, which I always think is like a really cool project because it was one of the first side chains that ever launched. You look at all the roll up stuff that's happening over on the Ethereum side, and it's not done nearly as well or with the same rigor. Um, or in a truly distributed, like decentralized way as like the Liquid project was. But a lot of Bitcoiners have a lot higher sensitivity to who owns the keys to my coins than like the Ethereum ecosystem seems to. So like as a project, like everyone is just very suspect of like the incentives around like the federation on Liquid, for example. Um, so, yeah, I think you're right to point out that like the incentives on layer twos are like sort of still not like an open question, but definitely like, um, what do you call it? Um, something that like are different per like every accounting system and every like a system for layer two is like slightly different, and trying to
Mhm.
figure out and making sure that you understand the incentives and who owns the keys and how your relationship to them is like not um I think that's definitely going to be something that we have to communicate to people, and it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, I think, for these different layer twos.
And then, as an extension of this incentives discussion, what about the incentives to use layer two at all? Like, I think about a scenario in which Bitcoin, blocks fill up and transactions get super expensive, and everyone rushes to try and use Lightning and get set up you know, set up with their own node and open their own channels, and it's just like cost a fortune. It Like, how do we prevent some kind of like rush to layer two where we overwhelm Bitcoin users and then get people feeling like, why am I even doing this Lightning thing? I just spent $500 opening 5 channels.
No, it's a really good point. I think this is where like as an ecosystem we need people to be seeing the value of the layer 2 solution. Maybe this kind of goes back to your earlier question of like it's like scaling is like a big thing that people use. Like what are other reasons that people would want to use layer 2s, right? I think the big one there is like speed for Lightning, right? It's called Lightning. Because you can make a transaction with Bitcoin that's final. It's instant settlement instantly, right? Unlike on the main chain, it might take an hour to get your transaction settled. which is pretty fast compared to like some of the banking times in America, where it's like it takes a day or two for funds to be instant to be settled, right? So an hour on Bitcoin is still an improvement for a large part of the American banking system. The Bit- Lightning is the ability to transact with Bitcoin instantly, right? So it's like very, very fast. So like in addition to the scaling, so it's not just the scaling thing, it's also like, okay, what other features does like this like particular layer two got you? And it's where Lightning's like real value proposition um has been how fast you can do it, right? You can do it really fast, and it also has a really nice value proposition that you like literally still hold the keys to the Bitcoin in Lightning, right? So like when you transact with Lightning, it's still Bitcoin that you hold and own. Um, so like I think what I'm trying to say is like how are we going to prevent everyone from like trying to switch over and like the main chain is clogged and it's terrible. I think the way that we do that is we make it such that all these other features that layer 2s can offer above the scaling, above the fact that they can do lots of stuff, is the ability to like transact really quickly, or the ability to, you know, on with liquid Bitcoin, like your ability to like build interesting cool contracts and do like interesting stuff with the Bitcoin there that you can't do other places. And so like by adding on all of these like adding these extra features, I think you get people to start moving over for reasons that are hopefully like hopefully getting people to start moving over before they like all need to move over, right? So like hopefully like everyone is like transacting with Lightning before we need everyone to be transacting with Lightning. And they're doing that because that makes it so much faster when they want to pay with Lightning. So everyone has Lightning. Hopefully everyone already has the Lightning like wallet set up somewhere with a balance in it, and then they can just always, and that just becomes like their de facto way of transacting on Bitcoin, isn't Lightning. And the reason that they're doing that is because it's like faster and like the invoices are so much better. And like the experience of transacting with Bitcoin on Lightning is superior to using the main chain. And so that's why you would use like the Lightning.
Okay, so now I think we've given a good chunk of time to layer two. I want to talk a little bit about beyond layer two. And I know this is a topic that is still, I don't have a good grasp on it. I don't know how many people do, but I hear discussions about layer threes and layer fours and fives and sixes. And the analogy of layers starts to break up for me there because I don't understand why these are additional numbers being put on top of two and one. They just seem like adjacent projects sometimes when people come up with, you know, layer threes and layer fours. Is there anything that belongs above layer two? What does that look like?
I'm gonna be honest. I have yet like my like I don't know. I think a while ago is like there is no such thing as like a layer three. Like is my like personal like I think these are marketing terms that people are trying to use to make their project sound like the next inevitable thing that like comes like once you have layer two, you then have their project, if that makes sense. My problem with this is like I really think of the layers, layer one and layer two, in terms of being able to transact and like settlement. So I think of layer two as being like a settlement layer, the same as layer one. The only difference between them is that layer two is transacting in a different accounting system, right? Which is kind of what I've been talking about. But like at the end of the day, it's all still Bitcoin. Like you're trading, you're dealing with Bitcoin. And you're settling, like layer two lets you settle with Bitcoin in a different like way, hopefully much faster, right? And like at scale is like kind of the thing. But it's all just like transacting with Bitcoin. So like these like layer one and layer two, like all of it has to do with transacting with Bitcoin. I think the thing that when people start trying to say layer three, layer four, is now they're no longer talking about transacting with Bitcoin. Now they're talking about logging into websites, or they're talking about like creating a marketplace, or they're talking about like some other maybe digital asset that you're able to transact with, and it just so happens that that digital asset is using like the Bitcoin data system, so to speak. So you're no longer like transacting with Bitcoin, you're transacting with something else, but it just so happened that that something else uses the Bitcoin ledger to do its accounting, right? So I would say that these things, like I think calling those layers is like definitely a stretch, because like the way that we define layer one and layer two is like we're transacting with Bitcoin. All of a sudden people are like, we want to do something else, and like fill in the blank what something else is. And it's like related to these things. Maybe it's like something that is like an offshoot of what, like, for example, being able to log into a website using your Lightning node. Like, that's not at all related to transacting with Bitcoin, which is kind of like the initial purpose of Lightning. It's like a feature that you get because of the system that we built to do that, to transact with Lightning. So you kind of have these like side effects that let you do stuff, and people are like, oh, well, let's call that a whole new layer. Um, I would strongly argue that that's not a layer, that's a new feature. It's cool. You can say like login with Lightning is a cool thing, and maybe login with Lightning isn't trying to call itself a layer three, in which case I apologize. But just as like I think a pretty concrete example of like a new thing you can do using this layer two system like Lightning, but I isn't it's not transacting with Bitcoin. So I would be like, I don't think that's a layer. Like I have yet to see something where I'm like, yeah, that's definitely like a layer three. I feel like maybe the closest thing is like people like, oh, well, you can build Liquid, you can build the Lightning Network on top of Liquid Bitcoin. So your layer one becomes Liquid Bitcoin, and your layer two, three would become the Lightning. I would almost say then no, you still just have a layer one and a layer two, except the layer one is like Liquid Bitcoin then, and the layer two is the Lightning network you've built on top of it. Like I really think that as soon as we start trying to add more layers here, I think I think it I think you just start losing meaning and people get confused because there is no rigorous there is no like really easy to understand framework of why that fits and how it fits in with like layer 1 and 2 kind of. Maybe the real mistake was numbering layer 1 and layer 2, because that gave people the impression that you could add a third number, because number lines go up. So like the real mistake here is that like we called layer 2. Really, we should have called it like, I don't know, still Bitcoin but faster or something. I don't know.
I think that's been one of the things that I've struggled with the most is coming up with a useful framework for what is layer two and what belongs there and what does not belong there. And I'm still kind of grasping, trying to figure out like how do we define this and how do we kind of make it clear to other people, especially to newcomers that are just entering the space and really trying to get their bearings. How do we make it clear what these protocols are actually for, and the architecture of them and the hierarchy and all that? I want to touch on two other hot topics of 2023, and I don't believe either of them fit into this layer analogy, but I want to hear your thoughts. Nostr and ordinals, where do they fit in this Bitcoin layer one, layer two ecosystem? Are they completely outside of it?
I mean, yeah, to me, 100%. Yes. Those are not, those projects are not trying to transact with Bitcoin, right? They're not about being a payment. I mean, I'm like a payment rails like maxi to some extent. Like I like payment rails. Like payment rails is like I think kind of unsexy, and like at some level it gets pretty boring. You're like, what do you mean I just can pay someone? It's like, yeah, that's what you can do with Lightning. You like pay someone with Bitcoin. Like, yeah, that's the thing. And I would say like, yeah, like, all layer twos are payment rails, and all of them are like to whatever extent kind of boring in that way. Ordinals and like Nostr are like Nostr is a communication protocol.
Now, that it's a communication protocol, though, that does have some integrations with Lightning, which
Sure.
I think muddied the waters a little bit with Zaps.
Yeah, but that's like, but it's just, but Nostr becomes the communication protocol that lets you negotiate how to like create a Lightning payment, right? So like the Zap is still happening on Lightning, which is like a layer two, which is lets you like as a Bitcoin transaction like platform, right? So all that like Nostr is letting you do is figuring out who to send a Lightning payment to. Like it's a directory of like who to send lightning to, and like gives you a motivation and a reason to send them lightning. But like the settlement and the movement of the Bitcoin is still all happening on lightning, right? So like Nostr is
Mm,
like the facilitation, like communication layer that helps you find people to send Bitcoin to. But when you want to send the Bitcoin, you're using an actual layer two, which is lightning, right? So
right.
um
That makes sense.
yeah, so like Nostr is like, again, like communication protocol. Like what is a communication protocol? That's like a whole nother thing, right? Like, is it, there's discovery there, like, finding new sources of information. It's sending messages. It's like advertising services, maybe. Like there's this recent paper, I think it's called CivKit from
Yes.
Antoine Riard and Ray from Paxful, and there was a third one that I don't.
Nicholas Gregory.
Yeah, yeah. That's like using Nostr to do communication, which is like, broadcast of like a XYZ. Like it's a negotiation of services, right? And like after you've negotiated the service, you will effectuate a payment. Like you will make a payment, and you will probably make the payment over Lightning. Um, but like that is like Lightning as a protocol can exist independently of the ability to coordinate payment, right? So there's a coordination problem on top of
Hmm.
the payment system, which is separate from this payment system. It's not the payment system. It makes the payment system to some extent more useful to you as a human, because as a human, one thing you probably like to do is sell services and get rewarded for them, right? Like exchange of like things that you can do and receive like, payment in return. But that whole coordination mechanism doesn't have anything to do with the ability to like send and settle like Bitcoin.
Right. Okay. And then for something like ordinals, is that just like a feature on layer one? Like where does that fit in the whole?
I mean, I think ordinals is like, yeah, having ordinals at my layer two conference is a little bit of like a joke. Like I think Casey knows this. Casey's been joking about it. Maybe we can make this joke, because Casey will be at. It'll be one of the few times not to like. That Casey's gonna do an actual ordinals workshop. He did his first ever ordinals workshop at Bitcoin Plus Plus in Austin last year, and so he's come back to do another one. But if you want to hear from Casey himself about ordinals, this is a great opportunity to come hang out and participate. But what is I trying to say? Ordinals. Okay, it's kind of funny because I've been talking a lot about layer twos from like, okay, it's an accounting system, right? Like it is a different way of keeping track of who owns what Bitcoin, right? So like a layer two gives you a new way of keeping track of who owns what Bitcoin that isn't transactions in a block. It's funny to think about ordinals for that perspective, because ordinals is a new accounting system, but it doesn't account for, so like layer twos account for who owns what Bitcoin. Ordinals is an accounting system for who owns which Satoshis, right? So like, and it no longer like who owns what Satoshis is still kind of dealt with by the Bitcoin like blockchain system, right? Like who owns them, the ownership part
Hmm.
is still accounted for in the Bitcoin ledger. Like who owns what Satoshis is like still a ledger problem. All that Ordinals does is gives you a new granularity around what exactly it is that you own in the Bitcoin blockchain. So it just adds it's a new numbering system. Maybe accounting is wrong. It's a new numbering system for Bitcoin. And as soon as you add this new numbering system, suddenly it gives you the ability to like, once you've numbered all the Satoshis, you can commit data to the blockchain at a particular Satoshi, and then people can like pay you for that Satoshi later or whatever.
Right.
Um, you're still using the main Bitcoin blockchain for who owns those Satoshis. It just gives you a new way of looking at and looking up any individual Satoshi in the blockchain. So it's a numbering system. It's not an accounting system. Maybe that's the big important part. Layer twos and layer one all are accounting systems, which are who owns what number. Um, Ordinals is a numbering system, which is just gives numbers. It's just numbers things.
Right. Okay, so this makes sense. Now I want to run through real quick. Let's run through the kind of like there's maybe 5 or 10 layer two solutions that are going to be highlighted at BTC plus plus. We've talked about a number of them today. I just want to hear your thoughts on what either excites you or concerns you about these protocols. So maybe we can start with Lightning. That is going to be the most commonly known, the one you and I spend the most time thinking about. What excites or concerns you about Lightning?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to see Lightning kind of get reach more into like the mobile stuff. So like, okay, I'm super excited about splicing. I know I said that earlier, but like splicing is so it's gonna be so big for like so I think like one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about on Lightning is like liquidity and like how it moves, how it gets bought and sold, like how like how we account for it because I did a lot of work on accounting for core Lightning bookkeeping stuff. So like where's Bitcoin, who has it, how does it get moved to the next place? Splicing is really, really, really exciting because it makes it such that you can um like your the money that you put into Lightning suddenly becomes like way more usable on chain in a way that it wasn't before. Um and what that's going to do is that's going to revolutionize, my hope is that it revolutionizes how um Lightning wallets for like end users work. So it makes like it should make your Lightning wallet like just way easier to manage because you no longer need lots of channels. In theory, you only need one channel, and I think it'll just make like it'll make your life a lot easier. So Lightning stuff, yeah, I'm like super excited about that. Like new splicing stuff on Lightning is super exciting to me. Um, I'm really excited about a talk that Barack is going to do where he's proposing a new, totally new way of doing Lightning, I think is what he's told me. So I've gotten top line. I think he sent me like a first draft I haven't looked through yet. But I'm really excited. Barack's like probably one of the like sharpest and more creative thinkers around how to do new ways of Lightning. So I'm really excited to see what he has for us about like just like a new way of having transactions on Lightning, kind of like what are the transactions to make Lightning look like. So he's been doing a lot of thinking of that, and I know it's his will definitely be like Taproot native. So what does Lightning look like? If we could reimagine Lightning and rebuild it from scratch, knowing that Taproot exists, what would that look like? And I think Barack's going to have a really interesting answer to that. There's also some interesting research coming from Clara from Unchained about how to like make Lightning harder to like do a denial of service attack for. Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff coming out of Lightning side. Um, what other projects are there? I'm really interested in like so Paul Stork or Truthcoin is going to tell us about BIP 300. I feel like BIP 300 is one of those things that I don't know a whole lot about, but I'm really excited to hear more from Paul about it because I think that it kind of like so like I've been saying like layer one, layer two is all about transacting with Bitcoin, and it gives you like a new primitives for doing Bitcoin transaction, like transacting with Bitcoin, but like it's just different accounting systems. I'm not really sure how to think about BIP 300 from like a from this perspective. I feel like BIP 300 sort of like almost veers into like what I would call like the assets on Bitcoin way. Like so RGB is like an asset on Bitcoin. Like Liquid tries issues like its own asset set. Like um the I think Truthcoin I think not Truth I think BIP 300 is like a way of issuing assets using Bitcoin. So it's like how do you keep what are assets? Assets are ledgers for other projects, for other like it's like an accounting system for a different type of object. So like the Bitcoin and like layer twos are all accounting for Bitcoin, like who owns Bitcoin and how much. Whenever you start adding assets, they're trying to like basically piggyback. Is my like sort of trying to piggyback on Lightning's like accounting system and infrastructure to do accounting for something else, um, something not Bitcoin. So I tend to say that those aren't layer twos, but they're like because a layer two you're doing accounting for Bitcoin. Um,
Mhm.
and so like layer 2 is like a Bitcoin accounting system that's like associated with main chain, and like there's only ever 21 million of Bitcoin across all of layer 1 and layer 2, right?
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just a quick message from our sponsor, Stackwork. Stackwork is a Lightning-powered platform for generating high-quality transcripts of all your audio or video content. They combine AI engines and hundreds of human workers all over the world who are paid over the Lightning Network to assemble these transcripts. And that's what lets Stackwork create better, faster, and less expensive transcripts. To see the results for yourself, you can check out my personal website where I host transcripts for all my podcast episodes. If you want to learn more about Stackwork, visit stackwork.com. That is STAK work.com. So maybe it makes sense to bundle then things like Liquid, Drive Chain, RGB into their own kind of category of being issuing assets on top of Bitcoin. Is there anything in particular that either concerns or excites you about that idea of issuing assets on Bitcoin?
Man, this is where this is one of those areas I try just to try to stay not really think about too much, because I'm I do payment rails on Bitcoin, which is Lightning. It's the stuff about liquidity and how liquidity moves is really interesting to me. That's a big and hard problem as in of itself. Think when you start getting into assets on Bitcoin, one of the worries that I've seen, I'm not really sure how big it is as a thing for reasons. I should probably write a whole series of blog posts about this. But like one of the big worries has to do with if you get an asset, let's say someone issues a bunch of Tether, as is the case on Liquid, right? There's a bunch of Tether issued on Liquid. The fear is that someone will make a transaction that has a huge amount of Tether moving some direction or the other. And this will incentivize miners. This will give miners incentives to include transactions or not include transactions in blocks, or to try to reshape the way that the chain looks, because there's now this other incentive, this other asset incentive, that gives them a monetary reason to rewrite how the existing chain looks, right? Because of this gargantuan amount of value that they could in theory get by rewriting the chain. And it's well, and the thing about that is okay, at some level, if Tether, for example, is a little bit of it's a fiat shitcoin, right? It's, what is that actually worth? How much does it actually cost Tether to print new Tether? So if someone can come in and print a bunch of assets and that they put into the Bitcoin accounting system, and now those assets suddenly become honeypots that you can attract miners to do things with, suddenly you have this vector of being able to influence what the mining ecosystem looks like, using this object that isn't hard to get. Bitcoin is hard to get, right? You have to mine it. It's limited. You can't just make more Bitcoin. You have to mine it. And that's why miners are mining, is to get access to this rare resource. But if suddenly you start issuing all of these, suddenly you start letting people issue bullshit coins on in a Bitcoin accounting system, such that miners are suddenly swayed by the bullshit coins that you've issued, is that going to corrupt and create bad incentives and kind of destroy the sort of nice, neat incentive structure that Bitcoin is built on? I think this is a bit of an open question. I think people are right to be asking it. I think it's an interesting question. I don't know how I mean, yeah, you could probably bribe a miner today with fiat, right? Give them $1 million to include a transaction or attempt to whatever. So maybe that's not as persuasive as an argument, but yeah, I think that's so that's without trying to pass judgment, just trying to lay out the what might the fear be around them. I think that's the one I've heard that I haven't done the intellectual work to either debunk or believe, if that makes sense. It's just okay, yeah, I could see that being a problem. I'm not really sure how much of a problem it is. And my whole thing is well, if we I'm probably not going to work to build that sort of system to add extra assets to Bitcoin, because that seems like something that's difficult to think about. If other people want to do that work, I would hope that they would spend the time, energy, and effort to actually do the necessary thinking and thought leadering pieces around like some of the risks that they might be introducing rather than just doing the work to add it without talking about the risks in public. But again, like I said, maybe that's a little bit like not my responsibility. I'm not building it. I like don't think I, like if you are going to do that work, you should probably put some thought into that piece of it. But yeah.
Interesting. Now let's talk about Fedimint as well. You brought that up a couple times today. Anything in particular that either excites or concerns you about Fedimint development?
Yeah, I think Fetties are really cool. I think eCash tokens are really, really cool and interesting. I think there's I want to be like totally like, yeah, they're super exciting and great. I think there's like a few things, and maybe they've got like, maybe I'm out of date in my information about how they work, but like the auditability of eCash systems is one thing that like always gives me pause about them. Um, Maybe they've figured this out, but it's like, and it's like at the core of the trade-off is the privacy, right? Like eCash is like, I wouldn't say perfect privacy, but it's like really good privacy. It's like much, much, much better than like any of the other systems I've seen. So eCash privacy is really, really good. One of the dark side, like the backside of that privacy, there's always a trade off. The dark side of that privacy is that it's very difficult to audit the system, which means it's very difficult to tell how many eCash tokens. So, like, if I deposit, so the way it should work, or it's supposed to work, is I deposit like a Bitcoin into an eCash like thing, and then I get like a Bitcoin worth of tokens, right? Um, Problem is that like it's very hard to prove at any point in time that the eCash system did not issue 2 Bitcoins worth of tokens for that 1 Bitcoin they got put in. It's very hard to prove that they're like your Bitcoin hasn't been is rehypothecated the word. What's the word where they like
Hmm.
issue like basically like that it's hard to prove that like you haven't basically been like they're not doing fractional reserve banking, but
Right.
maybe this is how we get fractional reserve bitcoin banking in Bitcoin, like hand wave, which is like problematic up to the point you want to withdraw whatever. So maybe that's a feature, not a bug. But I definitely think that that's like one thing that for me I'm just like yeah, I would be cautious isn't the right word maybe, but it's just like definitely something to think about. That being said, like I definitely think I would like keep an eCash token around, and I think it's like a really cool technology. So
And then one more question for you. If you were to get up on a stage in front of all the layer two builders, what is your one message you'd like to leave everyone with?
oh, that's a good one. Oh, I don't know, man.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. Like, okay, if we're building layer twos, what should we make things? I think really making it easy for people to understand like the connection of any particular layer two to layer one is really important. Like, what does that like multi-sig look like? Like, what is that like trust trade-off? Maybe that doesn't apply to every like layer two. Again, I need to like learn more about how rollups work because I feel like there's probably something I'm missing about that. But I think that like as a community, I think we really need to do a better job of making sure that like almost like this like I want to make like a form that like if you're layer two, you fill out the form and it's like a standard form. So any consumer can like go find the form that explains like the 3 things that they should know about that layer two, like who owns the keys to the multi-sig, how or like what is the accounting system, like what backs the accounting system, where does that live, and then like how do I get my coins out of the system, like who do I have to ask to get my money back on layer one, right? I feel like every like layer two project needs to like, should do their like should be like their form of communication to like the public or to their users. I think that would be really useful for people that want to like better understand like yourself or like, even me like a few years ago, just like when people say layer two, like, just like a better understanding of like what exactly where exactly your Bitcoin is and like how it's being accounted for and how you can get it out is like good information that every layer two should be able to give like any Bitcoin end user. I think that's important just for like a transparency thing, right? So making it more transparent to like a lot of people who aren't as technical or don't really understand the stuff nearly as well as ourselves. Um, Making it possible that we have more, I'm really into like people understanding, having more informed consumers and Bitcoiners like across the spectrum at every level is like very important as an ecosystem. Like Bitcoin should win because we have the like the smart, like the most informed like participants, and like like Bitcoiners don't get involved in like Ponzi schemes because they're like informed enough to know that that is a Ponzi scheme, right? So I think that if we as layer two builders can make it such that we have like a like agreed upon way of communicating what we're doing to the general public, I think that that would make the whole ecosystem a lot stronger.
Well said. Before you go, final note, can you just let listeners know where they can go to learn more about you and the upcoming BTC event?
Yeah, definitely. So Bitcoin plus plus, we've got a website. It's btcpp.dev. So btcpp.dev, so Bitcoin plus plus. And then I'm Lisa. I also go by Nifty Nye on Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter at NIFTYNEI. I'm also on Nostr. I can't just tell you what my Nostr pub key is though, so you can go look it up on like I think like Nostr directory is really great. So if you look at my Twitter name there, you'll find my Nostr pub key. So
Very cool. Thank you for taking the time. Hope we can do it again soon.
yeah, thanks, Kevin.
In the last 30 days, you guys sent in 99,283 sats. That came in from 72 different supporters. You guys have been also sending in a lot of messages. I think I've got them all here, but there's a lot of messages now coming in from all different platforms. So I'm trying to keep on top of it. If I miss your message, I'm sorry, but I think I've got all of your podcast messages here on Fountain. We have, let's run through the last week or so of messages. UTXO_1, who was the guest on episode 104, said, thanks for having me on. Definitely listen to that show if you have not already. Sir Fable says, great project in response to episode 104 on Nodeless. Kepford says, loving the show, Kevin. We have an anonymous user who says, thanks for always sharing awesome topics. All of these are on episode 104 with UTXO. Lumor sent in 2,000 sats and said, good dive into the aspiration to run a business without a bank account. That was an interesting segment. I really enjoyed that. Vake said, fire emoji and sent 2,000 sats. Blockchain Boog said, great idea for ticket management. The Nodl guys should implement this. Again, in response to episode 104. Blockchain Boog said, nodeless for the win. Sent 5,000 sats. He also said on Stacking Sats number 2 with Arnold Hubach, he said, yep, that bank account is so elusive. Hard to get banked if you're a Bitcoin company sometimes. Sometimes it's just hard to get banked in general. We have Orange Pill App said, great episode on episode 104. We had Marks who said, great discussion. Love to hear what Nodeless is doing and the mentality behind the decisions. Connor Chepanik sent 420 sats and said, fantastic rip. I'm thinking of a web app to build for my coding boot camp, and I'll have to check out Nodeless. Very cool, Connor. And then the Swiss Road to Crypto said, nice episode. Kevin, what is your Nostr handle? You ought to put it in the show notes. I will work on that. I'll put in a little tag in my descriptions from now on with my NIP-05, and hopefully folks can find me through that. I know sometimes it's a little bit hard still to search for people on Nostr. Putting my npub would be too long. It'd be too long of a string, and it would kind of clutter up the description, but I'll add in my NIP-05 and you guys can find me from there. Thank you again to everyone who has sent in sats this week, and I can't wait to see what you guys send in this week.